There are 6 teams on bye this week, which means there's a strong chance you'll need to hit on a sleeper or two to win your matchup. I've got 8 players who I think can help get you there. First player I want to talk about is Tyler Allgeier. So they go up against the Dolphins this week, and obviously Bijan should be ranked number 1. He should just feast in this matchup, but I think there's going to be enough for both of these two to operate. We've seen Tyler Allgeier get double-digit carries 4 out of his 6 games, so he's already getting a decent amount of work, but this is a game in which they should beat up on Miami. Would expect a very similar game script to what we saw week 2 against the Vikings for this team, and the Falcons averaged the 4th most rush yards per game. Obviously, Bijan is carrying the majority of that weight, but Allgeier is also just a very solid running back. And, the Falcons have a very good offensive line and they have a strong defense. And the Dolphins, on the other hand, allow more rush yards per game than any team in the league through the first 7 weeks. Look at what Rico Dowdle, Kamani Vidal, Quinshon Judkins did to them the last few weeks. And if you want to make the case that like Dowdle and especially Judkins are awesome, I totally get that, but I don't think anyone expected Kamani Vidal to do what he did. Obviously, those 3 were getting the lion's share of the workload, and again, Bijan is still going to feast in this one, but this is a game script I would expect to heavily favor the Falcons, and Vegas agrees, 7.5 point favorites in favor of the Falcons, so it's not like this is some big projection in terms of Allgeier getting carries. He had 2 weeks with 16 carries, and he hasn't had less than double-digit carries in any game that they've won. Plus, it's no secret that Miami is kind of hanging on by a thread in terms of morale, their confidence in Tua, Mike McDaniel's job, Jalen Waddle's Instagram. I think in a pinch, Allgeier is someone that you can plug and play if you're dealing with a ton of buys. Next guy up, Woody Marks. Such a weird game for the Texans on Monday night. Their offense looked completely lost, and obviously it didn't help that Nico left the game with a concussion, but even before that, he didn't really do anything with his 10 targets, and their offensive line just looks atrocious, but maybe what's more disappointing is how the offense overall has been structured. Last offseason, they fired their offensive coordinator, Bobby Slowick. They bring in Nick Haley, who was, the passing game coordinator for the Rams, and everyone's all excited to get a member of the Sean McVay coaching tree. But this team could not look less like the Rams. Side note, maybe we shouldn't just assume someone is going to be great because they spent time with Sean McVay. But tangent aside, we did see Woody Marks get the majority of the work this last week. He out-touched Nick Chubb 13-6. He wasn't necessarily efficient, but salvaged his week with a nice scramble drill touchdown. And, Marks taking over as the lead back is kind of what we expected after that blow-up spot week 4 against Tennessee. Then the Baltimore game script week 5 was so weird that you can almost throw that one out the window. Then coming out of the bye, we see it turn back in favor of Marks. And this week they get the 49ers at home. And I'm surprised to see the opening line at 1.5 points in favor of the Texans. But regardless, this projects to be competitive. And, the Niners defense is banged up. Losing Bosa and Warner for the season is a tough blow. And in the weeks that I mentioned earlier, where he's been getting over 50% of the snaps, has gotten 5 targets in each of those games. So that was really his calling card as a prospect, was, being an excellent pass catcher. He averaged 52 receptions a year across 5 years at Mississippi State and USC. That was also including a sophomore campaign where he caught 83 passes, which is just absurd. Next guy up, Kyle Monangai. So we saw him have his highest snap share and touches on the season this last week. He also gets his first rushing touchdown, which is always awesome to see. And, looking back at him as a prospect, he was just kind of a guy that I thought would fit really well into Ben Johnson's system. Is very similar to like a David Montgomery type, does all the little things great, yards after contact, broken tackles, doesn't fumble the ball whatsoever. So it was a little bit disappointing to see in the beginning of the season him not get a ton of work. But now, we're kind of seeing that come to fruition. And I think the way that he complements DeAndre Swift can be a big boost for Swift as well. We know Swift isn't necessarily going to be that grinder, but his skill set is valuable if used correctly. So I think with Monangai, we're going to see that continued increase with him. And surprisingly enough, he did catch 2 passes. He had 3 targets this past week, which wasn't really, his calling card as a prospect, but, similar to David Montgomery, who's not necessarily like a elite pass catcher by any means, but he's still got some work in the passing game in that system. So if he sees that role as well, I think he can be in for a nice second half. And this week specifically, since we're talking about sleepers, going up against the Ravens. So Baltimore's defense has been awful. And they made the Texans look like a juggernaut a couple weeks ago, but that obviously has to do with the fact that their offense can't move the ball at all without Lamar. So we'll see how everything looks if Lamar is back. I do think if Lamar is out, that Monangai is actually a pretty decent play. And even if Lamar does play, he could be a decent dart throw, assuming they're able to move the ball pretty effectively against this defense. Next guy up, Troy Franklin. So Franklin has been a pretty pleasant surprise so far this season. I really liked him as a prospect coming out of Oregon and then was kind of ready to give up on him after last year, but he's currently the wide receiver 37 on the season. And the issue with Franklin is he's always going to be pretty boom bust. Very similar to like a Jameson Williams type. And unlike JMO, who possesses a unique skill set on his own team, Franklin has Marvin Mims as his running mate, and they can kind of do a lot of the same things. And you're kind of at the mercy of how Sean Payton is feeling that day in terms of usage. But Franklin's coming off a game in which he had 10 targets. He salvaged his day with a touchdown, otherwise didn't do too much with him. But Bo Nix didn't really decide to wake up until the fourth quarter in that game. Side note, I feel so bad for the Giants fans in that one. They had that game in the bag, but we march on to this week. They go up against the Cowboys, who are an easy button for opposing offenses. And this is the highest over under total on the week. They're in Denver, and as good as the Broncos defense is, the Cowboys offense almost feels immune to that, as well as Dak has been playing. And now obviously with CeeDee Lamb back. So this one can easily turn into a shootout. And the tiebreaker for me in choosing someone like Franklin, someone a deep sleeper, if I'm in a pinch, is whether or not the team is expected to score a ton. So, for example, looking at Fantasy Pros, he's ranked next to like Allgeier Manor, who, has a chance to be the number one again this week if Ridley's out. But, can we really trust the Titans to score a lot of points? Probably not. Not to mention Franklin is explosive, so can easily rip off a big play at any. Next up, Tez Johnson. So Tez was a very popular waiver wire guy last week with all the uncertainty surrounding the status of Evans and Ibuka. Of course, both ended up playing, and unfortunately Evans went down, and who knows exactly when we will see him next. But in that game, Tez ended up with a 68% snap share, only behind Ibuka at the wide receiver position. He ends up getting 9 targets, only caught 4, but went for 58 yards and a touchdown. That touchdown he scored was awesome. I saw a tweet from someone that said Tez looked like he was pressing all the buttons in Madden on that play, which I thought was pretty funny. And, Tez is someone who, if you've been following Oregon the past couple seasons, are not surprised whatsoever with how he looks. So given how banged up the Bucs receiving core is, I would expect his role to kind of stay the same this week. And, they get the Saints, whose defense isn't great, but more importantly, I think Baker is going to just come out firing this one. Like overall, that performance on Monday was very disappointed by he and the Bucs. And, the Bucs have shown that they're not the type of team that are just going to have a conservative game plan against a lesser opponent. So I think we see a big bounce back from Baker in this one. I think a 3 touchdown performance is absolutely in the cards. Next up is Josh Downs. So this one is as simple as targeting a good player on a good offense. And at this point, I think we might have to call the Colts a great offense. So unfortunately, Downs missed last week due to a concussion. So monitor that. But typically players only miss a week. But, 6 catches in each of the last 2 games. And he's never going to be a huge touchdown guy. But if he did get into the end zone week 6, and you're also going to have to live with the fact that he's only going to be out there for 50 to 60% of the snaps, but the Colts offense is averaging 33 points per game. And this week they get the Titans, who are of course one of the worst teams in the NFL and literally have no shot of stopping the Colts. Now, to present the negative side of that coin is we've already seen the Colts face the Titans, and of course the Colts dominated that game, but Downs was pretty much non-existent in that one, so there's a good chance he gets game scripted out. There's also a real chance we see another 3 touchdown game from Jonathan Taylor, who's playing on another planet right now. But in a pinch, give me Downs on the team that's going to score a ton of points. Side note, he is available in about half the leagues on Sleeper, so you might want to check if he's there regardless, because I think he can have some rest of season value. The tight end position, Cade Otton, didn't want to necessarily include 2 players on the same team, having Otton and Tez Johnson, but Otton is currently the tight end 17 on Fantasy Pros ECR this week, so I did want to include him to make sure he's on your radar. And we talked about this previously with the Mike Evans injury, and it doesn't sound like Chris Godwin is going to be back, so they're very depleted at pass catchers. And Cade Otton, he's a very, very solid player, very underrated player. We saw in a stretch last year when he had to be the number one, he really stepped up and he's extremely efficient. And he's been quietly very solid the last 3 weeks. And I would expect that to continue this week. And, I mentioned this before, but I would personally be betting the over for Baker's touchdown prop this week coming off a bad game on Monday night. So you see, the efficiency between Baker and Otton. And of course, tight end targets are usually closer to the line of scrimmage, but he's still racking up 81, 51, and 65 yards in those last 3 outings. So another guy I would feel comfortable plug and playing this week at tight end position if I'm missing someone like Trey McBride, for say. Last player I want to talk about for our Superflex audience is Tyrod Taylor. So Justin Fields was benched last week during the game, and now Tyrod Taylor sounds like he is the starter. So if you watched us in the offseason, we warned about drafting Fields in Superflex because you don't want to be targeting QBs who might get benched. In one QB leagues, he was a fine target because you can get Goff or Stafford off the wire. So hopefully, if you are in Superflex and do have Justin Fields, you're able to get Tyrod. Maybe you already had him, but I digress. And with Taylor, it's not like he came into the game last week and lit the world on fire. He had 2 picks and no touchdowns, but in his one start this season, he had a solid game. He had a couple passing touchdowns and another 48 yards on the ground. And this matchup against the Bengals this week is just too good to ignore. And, Aaron Glenn said, hopefully they'll get Garrett Wilson back this week, which would be a huge boost, but I don't necessarily think that's going to happen because they do have a bye in week 9 and kind of want to protect their young player. And of course, having him as a sleeper this week has a ton to do with the matchup, right? They're playing maybe the worst defense in the league in the Cincinnati Bengals, and maybe he only throws 1 touchdown pass, but if he can get 50 yards and a score on the ground, could be a quietly very solid start. With that, thank you guys so much for watching and good luck this week.